So, the Punisher might be one of Marvel's most popular and captivating characters, but there is a whole lot of misinformation floating around regarding him. And given Frank Castle's unique position in the Marvel Universe, that makes sense. I mean, he's one of the few anti-heroes in the publisher's world that straight up kills people, but let's try and uncover some truths here today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 things that everybody gets wrong about the Punisher. Number 10. The reason behind the violence. Although mainstream interpretations of the character would tell you that Frank Castle wasn't an inherently violent man, that his path to vigilanteism was birthed the moment that his family were killed, the reality is a little more nuanced. Garth Ennis's Punisher series is seminal for a whole host of reasons, but the key one is undoubtedly the writer's decision to reappraise Frank Castle's ideology. This came in Punisher Born, which, apart from being considered one of the greatest Punisher tales ever, really made an effort of showing the burgeoning moments of Frank's Punisher self. That moment occurs during an attack on Valley Forge, where the then scout sniper is left as the sole survivor of an enemy ambush. Ennis shows Frank making a metaphorical deal with the devil in order to survive, and hints heavily that the character's path to vigilanteism was formed in the fires of that battle. It's a fascinating angle to consider, especially since more conventional interpretations have largely reiterated the primacy of his family's murder in forcing the character's violent response. What Ennis does, in this sense, is add a whole other layer of tragedy to Castle, and provide veritable proof that, although people will try otherwise, the character is not one to be romanticized. Number 9. His allies. Popular opinion would dictate that Frank Castle is something of a lone wolf, and for the most part that is indeed the case. The Punisher's by no means a team player and has double-crossed more superhero team-ups than one would care to mention. But that doesn't mean that he's refrained from having a partner on occasion, however. His most famous long-time collaborator happened to be a guy called Micro, an ex-member of military intelligence who outfitted Frank with a whole host of gadgets, weaponry, and intel. But even then, their relationship was more complex than some would suspect. Although the pairing is certainly iconic, the two actually went their separate ways during the OG War Journal spin-off, and it led to deadly consequences. There, Micro protests that Frank has gone too far in his vigilante efforts, and is becoming more and more like the villains that he kills. He even goes so far as to pick out a replacement vigilante, and Frank, upon discovering this, ends up confronting Micro in a firefight, only for the one-time ally to be killed by a third party. But that's not to mention what happened in Max either, where the Punisher kills his friend after Micro attempts to take him to safety. The main thing to take away from this is that Castle does not play well with others, but he can if he wants to for a short time. Number 8. Where he works best. Despite the Punisher having been the subject of many a revered run over the years, the simple fact of the matter is that the character works best when placed next to Marvel's other heroes. This dynamic was best displayed in Season 2 of Daredevil, where John Bernthal really let loose with Castle as he verbally sparred with Matt Murdock on Hell's Kitchen's rooftop. The scene, inspired by an issue from the aforementioned Ennis Max series, illustrated what Castle can bring to the less murderously inclined amongst New York's heroes. Daredevil is forced to justify his brand of vigilanteism and the implications of it, and Castle has to operate in a community that outright shuns his methods. It's an endlessly fascinating dynamic that writers today continue to mine, and while there hasn't been a shortage of brilliant solo Punisher stories in the past, most of the better ones have come at the behest of a botched team-up and/or superhero interaction. Daredevil and Punisher always seem to conjure a brilliant storyline when they interact, but other characters like Blade and Captain America manage to do the same as well. Indeed, Frank's perception of Steve Rogers always seems to make for a compelling story, with Cap personifying the hero Frank wishes that he could, but ultimately can't be. That's brilliant no matter how you look at it, and while there's no doubt that the Punisher will be the subject of brilliant solo series in the future, it'll be the team-ups that fans anticipate the most. Number 7. It's all lethal. While there's much to make of Frank Castle's lethal tendencies, I mean, the dude is a fan of guns after all, he didn't always used to kill his enemies, preferring instead to pelt them with volley after volley of subsonic ammunition. Dubbed mercy bullets, rubber ammunition was Castle's weapon of choice during the formative years of his crime-fighting career, and he even continued to use them when collaborating with other heroes like Daredevil and Spider-Man. Frank was actually using the ammo as recently as 2014, where he managed to take down Elektra with nothing more than some topically applied rubber. And while yes, live ammo is and always will be the Punisher's weapon of choice, it's important to remember that he's not as rigid as some would say. If he needs help from a hero and the mandate is not to kill, then you can bet that he'll leave the FMJ in his locker. Considering that he's just as effective without it, it's not as big a distinction as one would initially think. Number 6. Which film is his best? So let's face it, Punisher Warzone is the best that Frank Castle has ever been on the big screen. Thomas Jane might have delighted audiences with his authentic and more human portrayal of the Marine veteran in the 2004 production, but the rest of the film is overhyped and underwhelming. John Travolta is as kooky as ever as the film's antagonist, the action is thin and interrupted by forgettable characters, even if they were inspired from the comics, and despite the fact that Jane looks the part, he's never really given much to do with the role, and the less that is said about the Dolph Lundgren film, the better. Ray Stevenson, on the other hand, the star of Lexi Alexander's film, looks just like the Castle of the comics and has the ice-cold demeanor to match. On top of that, Wayne Knight of Seinfeld and Jurassic Park fame was the perfect Micro, and even Dominic West did well in the role of Jigsaw. The film certainly has its flaws and is blown away completely by Bernthal's efforts in the MCU, but it's still the best big-screen feature to have taken an interest in Frank Castle, or at the very least, the most authentic. Jane still manages to dominate conversation though, perhaps aided in part by the Dirty Laundry short a few years back, and while there are certain positives that can be gleaned from that film, it's Alexander's that emerges up top. Number 5. He's always been an anti-hero. Although the Punisher of today might commonly be viewed as an anti-hero, he didn't originally start off like that. In fact, when he was first introduced in The Amazing Spider-Man number 129, the character was portrayed as being an out-and-out villain, and one with a serious bone to pick with Spidey. Later series would, of course, transform the character into the Punisher we know today, but the Jerry Conway and John Romita penned issue was never quick to make that delineation. It makes it clear that the Punisher is a vigilante, but not a particularly intuitive one at that. After getting hired by the Jackal, the most villain-looking villain you'll ever see, Castle goes after Spidey fully invested in the concept that he's just a normal criminal. Learning that, this wasn't the case, Castle leaves to appear in future Spidey titles, and while the Punisher's characterization has remained relatively consistent since, it's easy to forget that he was originally introduced as a Spidey foe, and not as the most morally complex vigilante that we know today. Number 4. His name. Yes, we all know that the Punisher is called Frank Castle, but did you actually know that he was born Francis Castiglione? The character is actually of Sicilian descent, and even trained to be a Catholic priest until he decided that he couldn't forgive criminals and other evildoers. Castle's religious background also adds another dynamic to his relationship with Daredevil. It's a small detail, and while Frank Castle is a brilliant name in every sense, the character's Sicilian background is all too often overlooked. In regards to the character being used as a critique of the American dream, and with New York representing the gateway to that dream for so many migrants, it's an integral aspect at that. Thankfully, the TV series does look to give it the attention that it deserves. Number 3. His inspiration. Anyone who's anyone will know that the concept of a grief-stricken, highly trained vigilante going on a revenge-driven rampage is one that is fairly ubiquitous throughout pop culture. What with all the Liam Neesons, Bruce Willises, and Kevin Costners of the world rehashing that trope fairly well for the last 2 or so decades, so it should come as no surprise to learn that the Punisher isn't particularly an original concept either. Although comparisons have been leveled between the character of Frank Castle and the Paul Benjamin character from Death Wish, comic historians commonly point towards Don Pendleton's Executioner series for having inspired the Marvel hero. The similarities are certainly stark, with both leads sporting a battle van of sorts, a similar narrative style, which is a war journal that is being used in both series, and an equally familiar gallery of rogues. Jerry Conway cited the Pendleton novels specifically when he described the creative process that birthed the character, and given the popularity of those books at the time, it kind of makes sense. They even bear a similar namesake, and while the Punisher has done much to distance himself from Pendleton character throughout the years, there's no getting away from the fact that his origin, tragic as it may be, is fairly derivative. Number 2. His weaponry. It's not all about the firearms when it comes to Frank Castle. In fact, the character has gotten seriously creative over the years, having used everything from the Green Goblin's pumpkin bomb to the same villain's glider on occasion. He's gotten his hands on Pym particles, and even the entire Ant-Man suit, as well as Captain America's shield, Hawkeye's quiver, and Dr. Octopus's tentacles. The man is very resourceful, and while the use of these more outlandish weapons might not sit well with the Punisher faithful, it's an interesting prospect to consider all the same. Like, why wouldn't Frank Castle try and use his enemies' weapons against them? Sure, it might not fit his style, but using the Goblin glider makes perfect sense in the 616 context, especially when he lacks the powers to compete with the universe's heaviest hitters. And number 1, his problematic elements. Let's not beat around the bush here. Frank Castle is a very controversial character. Interesting, yes. Idolized, wrongfully so. The Punisher is not your typical Marvel hero. He kills coldly, without remorse, and often does so in grotesque and even sadistic ways. That makes him a fascinating character to dissect in the sense that he's diametrically opposed to popular perceptions of what it means to be a hero, but all too often we see people idolize Frank Castle as a symbol of resistance, power, and ideological purity. Now, there's nothing wrong with liking the Punisher. He is, after all, a uniquely entertaining and wholly absorbing character to engage with. However, there is a massive problem at play here when so many people can so fundamentally misread the character that they place him above others as the ideal superhero to celebrate rather than castigate. We've seen as such in real-life context. Police officers and military units have adopted the character's symbology, emboldened by Castle's simplistic and uniquely callous ideology where life itself is of trivial importance in the pursuit of justice. Now that is a major concern, particularly when writers have repeatedly bludgeoned home the point that Frank Castle is who he is because of violence. Worse still, it intimates a disregard for legal process, and while the same rule could be applied if, say, the bat symbol adorned military and police equipment, Batman doesn't kill or display a sacrosanct or as brutal a dogma as his black and white counterpart most certainly does. It is okay to enjoy the Punisher, but now, more than ever, it is important to be aware of how the character can be misappropriated. And in a setting as volatile as today's, that is essential. And there we go, my friends. Those were the 10 things that everybody gets wrong about the Punisher. I hope that you enjoyed that, and please let me know what you thought about it down in the comment section below. As always, I've been Jules, so you can go follow me over on Twitter at RetroJ0, or you can swing by Live and Let's Dice where I do all of my Warhammer streaming and other gaming stuff outside of work, and it'd be great to see you over there. As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.